Okay, welcome everybody to our first invited guest lecture talk in the spring of 2021. Even though we are in the second half of the spring semester, the topic of the talk is post-pandemic language teaching, our window of opportunity. And our guest speaker for today is Dr. Bryan Smith of Arizona State University. Dr. Smith is professor of applied linguistics in the Department of English at ASU, where he directs the graduate certificate in computer assisted language learning. He is also co-editor of the Calico Journal and serves on the editorial advisory boards of various scholarly journals in the field of both applied linguistics and second language acquisition. On top of that, he conducts research at the intersection of CAL and instructed second language acquisition, and has focused on topics such as learner interaction, learner attention to form, the effects of teacher corrective feedback, and learner alignment during task-based interaction. He has published his research in journals such as the Annual Review of Applied Linguistics, Calico, Applied Linguistics, among others. And in his current work, he focuses on task-based learner multimodal interaction via mobile devices, learners' incidental focus on form, and also how the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to affect language teaching and learning moving forward, which will also be the topic of today's lecture, of course. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bryan Smith.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for the kind invitation from the Columbia University LRC. I'm just very pleased to be here with you all today, and pleased to share some bits of knowledge I've gathered over the last few months from dozens of our colleagues. And this is one of the caveats I'd like to throw out there, that very little of what I'm going to talk about today is my own original thought, but rather a compilation of snippets from interviews that I've conducted with respected colleagues from the Calico world, the CAL world, the IELTS world, etc. And I also apologize for the fact that I'm going to be reading from some notes today. I just simply haven't had time to rehearse this, since it's brand new, in a way that I'd feel comfortable just winging it, not least of all because I'm using quotes from colleagues throughout the talk, and I'd really like to get that right rather than improvise. So thank you again. Let me try to get my slides working right here. Okay, very good. So when I talk about computer-assisted language learning and teaching, or CAL, I like to use this quote from Ray Clifford, which is now about 3 decades old. And I do this in order to underscore the point that CAL proponents are never really talking about replacing teachers with technology, but rather we advocate for the thoughtful, deliberate, and measured use of technology where appropriate in order to achieve our curricular goals. Some of you certainly know Bob Blake at UC Davis and his book, A Brave New Digital Classroom. And in that book, he points out that this is one of the major myths or misconceptions that teachers often have about CAL. So turning to the present day and speaking really only about language teaching in higher ed for the moment, what is interesting to note is that for the most part, language teachers are not being replaced by teachers who use technology, but we are gradually, or not so gradually, actually becoming those very teachers, at least to a certain extent. And what I'd like to discuss today is what I see as a golden opportunity we have right now as language teachers and researchers and teacher educators to build back better in a way that is beneficial for learners, faculty, administration, industry, and our field more broadly. And what this will take is for us to all acknowledge the potential benefits of such a transformation and take on the challenges in a way that is humane and which makes good pedagogic sense and physical sense moving forward. So in preparation for this talk, I spoke informally with dozens of colleagues across various areas of L2 teaching, university lower and upper division classroom teachers, their students, language department chairs, language technology specialists, call researchers, as well as those in industry. And one very obvious thing that came out of these discussions is that the current crisis and universities' response to it has shown that we can harness digital technology to teach languages, even completely online. Now, call practitioners have been advocating for this for a long, long time, and we knew that it was possible and even effective if done right. Now, L2 teachers in general have experienced the is possible part, and it's time now to move to the if done right part. So I'll talk about our opportunity in terms of three phases: a triage phase, which is our current phase, a reflective and guided implementation phase, or transition from current to the near future, and finally, what language teaching with technology could look like when we do build back better. Now, one thing that we need to do from the outset is not to confuse emergency remote teaching, which was unplanned and executed in response to a crisis, with online teaching, which requires careful planning and attention during the implementation. Online teaching also requires us to identify and make use of the affordances of specific technologies within the framework of instructed SLA. And CALL seeks to harness computer technology in a way that will facilitate second language development. And just to clarify, to my knowledge, none of my CALL colleagues advocate for a wholesale move to online teaching. Rather, we argue that language practitioners should be able to identify and implement those technologies and technology-mediated tasks that will best supplement good face-to-face teaching and even extramural language learning. And we should also acknowledge the obvious, that CALL is not equal to simply using Zoom. So there are several publications that detail what many of us have experienced in these initial months of the pandemic, and even attempt to look into the future. My point today is not to provide an update on this scholarship, but rather just share what dozens of my CALL colleagues have told me some 10+ months into the pandemic, in a series of informal conversations over the past few months about their specific experiences, ongoing concerns, and opportunities they see for the future moving forward. From my discussions, it seems that language teachers in general, and more so than in other disciplines certainly, have or had the mindset that it was not possible to learn languages online. This basic belief may explain some of the difficulty that CALL has had in becoming more the norm rather than the exception. Now we've seen that holding language classes online is possible and may even work to a certain extent. What teachers are also realizing is that such courses require more, not less work in terms of planning and implementation. At least 2 language center directors noted that for some people, the amount of time that they spent with technology in a month was more than they had spent in their entire career teaching. And many teachers reported to them that they were surprised that things actually worked. And this might be because their expectations were set so low. So if nothing else, the COVID crisis has shined a spotlight on teaching with technology. And I'm focusing on language teaching here specifically. When asked what positive changes have come out of this triage, emergency remote teaching phase, one of my colleagues said, well, at least now we're no longer fighting the Luddites. And some of you might imagine who that person was. I prefer to characterize this same point in another way and say that we now have we all have a what you might call a shared reference point, which is always good. And there's been an inescapable opening of faculty eyes to technology for teaching, even among those who insisted they could never do it. The same can be said for students. So if we're faced with a similar situation in the future, this process of learning online won't be alien to them. There's now at least a shared awareness that teaching with technology not only exists, but it's also possible to actually do it at some level. During this time, many teachers have had to or have chosen to experiment with tools that they would have never touched otherwise. And many have noticed how technology affects things like learner behavior. Also good. A couple of teachers reported, for example, that they've noticed that shy students get to have a say during the lessons, which reminds me of some call research that Rick Kern did about 25 years ago. So this eye-opening that occurred during this phase also applies to seasoned call practitioners. For example, one colleague with decades of experience and dozens of publications was wondering why they never moved to more online tutorial approaches for teaching advanced L2 writing. Things like having students conduct peer reviews of writing in a way it's easier, frankly, when doing it online than, say, via Google Docs in person, at least for a first go round of the writing peer review. Class time can be spent better on issues that emerge from this online work and that are more palatable to face-to-face instruction. So more than one colleague pointed out that the more advanced classes are working well without much adjustment. And this is largely because students already possess strong language skills, arguably. Transitioning the lower language classes seems to have been a lot more difficult for some, not only because the students don't have as many advanced language skills, but also because some of the instructors who teach those classes, many of whom are graduate students themselves, don't have especially strong skills, and typically absolutely no training in teaching with technology or call. Some of the more prestigious schools were able to solve this problem by implementing things like co-teaching, where you would match a seasoned L2 teacher with a graduate student, but I don't think most schools have that luxury. Surprisingly, despite all of the memes to the contrary, many students report that they actually liked breakout rooms in Zoom when I interviewed students and faculty associates teaching lower and upper division language. So the first quote is interesting. Breakout rooms make discussing with partners easy because in a normal classroom, I get distracted with having a lot of people around me. This perception of there being less distraction in Zoom compared to face-to-face classes appeared again and again in comments. Many students also find it easier to speak up in breakout rooms, and they often have the perception of getting more speaking practice this way. Over to the second quote, breakout rooms. I think they're particularly helpful in language classes because it gives more time for speaking practice. Breakout rooms have worked quite well in the language class because it allows you to talk to people and students tend to correct each other or even explain things in an easier way than the professors might. This anecdotal evidence also confirms some existing call research regarding peer-peer, non-native, if you will, interaction. Quote 4, the chat option makes clarification questions easy to ask and integrate into the lesson without being disruptive. One final thing that appeared now and then were quotes like this, number 5. One of the things I like is that you don't know who will be in your breakout room, so you can speak to everyone in the class. And this was something I really hadn't thought about, but it's really, I suppose, an issue of face-to-face classroom management. And what this tells me is that students are open to and appreciate the affordances offered by online speaking practice, in this case with other students. So that's one side, but reasonable people can disagree about this.
I hate having online classes because when you go out into breakout rooms to do like a group project, no one talks. I'm literally asking questions and not getting a response. I'm not muted right now. They can hear what I'm... you guys.
All right. So students that report not liking breakout rooms typically reference technical difficulties with setup and things related to poor task design, I suppose, like wasting time. There's also a dislike for the Zoom silence, or get ready to cringe, silence, as I call it. Such silence has sparked some actual research that will hopefully build upon the existing literature on the role of silence in interaction from decades ago. And you can see a reference by Uschi Stickler on the last slide. Uschi is at the Open University, some of you might know. All right, so let's back up a bit. The initial shock in spring 2020 was met in many cases with a heroic rush to accommodate enrolled students. A massive number, as you know, a massive number of digital tools were made available along with the requisite training. And frankly, most universities seem to do a good job at providing support for faculty where needed. One thing that I noticed in my talks with call colleagues is that even tools that have been around for a long time and which have been used in call research were often rejected by students. One colleague told me a story involving VoiceThread, which on paper should work quite well for moving from a text-based to multimodal interaction. The students hated it, even going so far as saying that they preferred spending class time in breakout rooms rather than learning and using VoiceThread. And one of the biggest problems with this rollout of tools is that faculty largely felt that administration was starting from the assumption that we all teach the same way across disciplines, and that language learning is the same as other types of learning. So I don't want to get sidetracked with an SLA discussion on that last point, but let's just say that many faculty reported this feeling, that admin assumed that Zoom and other tools would work equally well in teaching engineering as it would in language classes. Of course, we were or are still in this triage phase. So we need to keep in mind that we need to applaud universities for the steps that they did take in avoiding even more layoffs, furloughs, etc. The other issue to keep in mind is that university technology offices, as you know, are mostly concerned with security at the institutional level. This is why they get behind certain tools and not others, and these tools have all gone through an extensive security vetting process. But these tools may or may not be good for teaching and learning languages. So what we're seeing is a sort of forced digital transformation, and digital transformation is the integration of digital technology into all areas of business, fundamentally changing how you operate and deliver value to customers. It's also a cultural change that requires organizations to continually challenge the status quo, experiment, and get comfortable with failure. Now, according to some of my colleagues in industry, one big mistake that businesses make very often when pursuing digital transformation is they put a whole bunch of new tools in place. But the problem is that if you don't change your organization to make use of the new tools in a productive and efficient way, you're not going to see any of the possible benefits in terms of improved customer satisfaction, experience, improved productivity, agility, efficiency, etc. So you've got to change processes and ways of thinking. For example, how you structure people's days and the roles that they play. Now, I acknowledge that this isn't a perfect analogy, but I think that the same set of issues might apply in our current situation regarding language teaching. You know, if you bring in digital tools, but you still keep teaching the same way, then it's kind of like putting a square peg into a round hole. Many teachers and chairs have told me that this is exactly what seems or seemed to be happening. One manifestation of this attitude is the so-called concurrent classroom model, whereby the instructor is in the physical classroom with whichever students choose to attend in person, while other students attend live classes virtually. Instructors report that they are still trying to figure this out, and how it can work. And spoiler alert, I don't think it can work. This is a model that my own institution has been using. The only way that this idea makes sense, in my opinion, is if the administration thinks that we're all lecturing, which might be the case. Okay, So as we emerge from this triage phase, one thing that we need to understand is that technology alone is not going to make your courses better. What we've done is to keep our heads above water. And we've seen that the crisis has shined a light on technology and language teaching and has given us a shared experience of teaching with technology. It's introduced us to many, perhaps way too many tools to consider, which was surely an eye-opening experience for many. And it may have even sparked a bit more interest in the research into technology-enhanced language teaching and learning. At least we can hope. So in phase one, we all witnessed new tools popping up like mushrooms, some good, some dangerous, and it's perhaps understandable that there was little faculty involvement in planning and reacting to the crisis situation in phase one. And none of my colleagues I've spoken with reported otherwise, frankly. However, we're now at a stage in this ongoing pandemic where we must move from a delivery of tools and one-size-fits-none training mindset to what I'll call active, reflective, and guided implementation. In phase one, it seems that many of us simply tried to replicate what we were doing in the face-to-face classroom in an online environment. The silver lining to this is that in doing so, that spotlight showed us that what we were doing beforehand maybe wasn't all that great after all. For example, one colleague reported that when they started teaching online, it became clear to many in their department that lots of them were lecturing much, much more than they thought they were. So the first thing we need in phase two are call experts that can help guide teachers in the evaluation and selection of tools that match their pedagogical goals. We can think of this in terms of what Phil Hubbard calls teacher and learner fit. So teacher fit has to do with whether the language teaching approach reflected in the technology, courseware, app, whatever, is consistent with or compatible with your own as a teacher. And you shouldn't necessarily rely on what the designer claims here. Learner fit has to do with how well content, skills, and language level of the technology correspond to your students' needs, especially as determined by your curricular objectives. Part of learner fit, of course, is how well the courseware fits your students' interests and learning styles, and how it fits students' existing cultures of use. In other words, how well it fits with the way your students currently select and utilize digital devices and apps for personal and social purposes. Second, call experts will be instrumental in teacher education, in teaching courses focusing on call, research, praxis, and related courses that are all relevant to instructed SLA. We absolutely must find a way to make this teaching with technology business palatable for teachers moving forward. We also have to start thinking differently about how our classes are organized and what we're trying to accomplish and how all of these tools work together. So after talking with several language technology specialists, it seems that faculty can be put in one of three categories. On the right, the pro technology plus good technology skills. In the middle, the faculty are pro technology, but not so good skills, technologically speaking. And then the anti-technology and also not so good technology skills. And moving forward, the two groups on the ends don't need much attention, I don't suppose. One will continue using technology no matter what, the other will not. That middle group is where we can make the most progress. Of course, the groups to the right also need to make sure that they have the evaluative skills and matching technologies with their curricular goals. And so we now have a bit of time to catch our breath. And many report that they're revisiting the current instructional models that have been in place for years. For example, we've seen what is possible in hybrid formats, what seems to work well synchronously, and what seems better suited for asynchronous modalities. Some colleagues have reported that they're experimenting with moving from a 5-day per week in-person model, like we have here at ASU, to a hybrid model that has 2 asynchronous days or more. Early reports are that students in those sections where they're piloting this idea actually worked more overall in this new format. So how best to use the classroom time and asynchronous sessions is the key here. Language teachers often remarked on the lack of speaking practice available in the classroom, and this issue seems to have been amplified after moving online. Surely technology can help in this regard. I'll talk about this briefly in the next section. So we've seen that the crisis has stimulated a lot of self-reflection about our pedagogy. Going back to that previous example, for many, our experiences felt like we were looking at ourselves in the mirror and realizing that maybe we weren't teaching the way that we really thought we were. Such self-reflection opens the door to a huge opportunity if we choose to take the note. During phase 2, most faculty are becoming more confident about their own abilities in teaching online and with using technologies, which speaks to the opportunity that we currently have to get it right moving forward. Regardless of whether we go back entirely to face-to-face or not, there's been an opening of the blinds just a little bit, and call is there for teachers and administrators as they reflect on what their technology-enhanced pedagogy should look like. So moving forward, our overarching goal should, in my opinion, be to find the right mix of online versus face-to-face instruction, which also includes finding the right balance between synchronous and asynchronous modalities and the tools that'll help us achieve our curricular goals. In my opinion, there really needs to be a required call course in every applied linguistics related degree program, or an L2 specific technology element of some sort should be infused into every undergraduate and graduate program, having to do with language learning and teaching, of course. So some programs are obviously doing this already, but for the majority who aren't, such a course should not simply focus on specific technologies, which also speaks to one of the most commonly held misunderstandings about CALL that Bob Blake refers to in his the book, Brave New Digital Classroom, that today's technology is really all we need to know. Such a course would explore the research on CALL relevant to instructed SLA, and a second course or a second part of that same course should ensure that students become skilled at identifying the affordances of any technology relative to their curricular goals and its potential for helping facilitate language development. With a few exceptions, such courses are not typically a requirement in foreign language programs, MTESOL programs, applied linguistics graduate programs, etc. In fact, most of my CALL colleagues report that they rarely, if ever, get to teach a CALL specific course. So segueing from my discussion and suggestions above, in phase 3, language teachers themselves will become skilled at identifying digital tools and creating technology-mediated tasks that help them reach their pedagogical goals. And this pandemic experience has raised the bar of what faculty are expected to know as a baseline. And this is a good thing. Language technology experts, for example, no longer need to explain to people what Zoom is or what it does, and faculty are now asking different and more sophisticated questions about technology. Even with an enhanced general proficiency in teaching with technology, there will still be a continued need for CALL expertise in phase 3. After all, we don't only need skilled general practitioners in medicine, but specialists as well. CALL experts will also need to help their departments design the right mix of face-to-face and virtual meetings. And what those digital environments should look like based on the local context will also be part of this discussion. But universities and colleges, as well as departments and individuals, will need to want to ask for this expertise. And from my experience, universities are not very good at tapping into the expertise of their own faculty when making decisions. In phase 3, a change in mindset about technology will have occurred. No one will have the opinion that asynchronous days means no work for the instructor. Of course, it's up to faculty to make that case, but admin must be open to this possibility. And this opinion, by the way, is real. I've witnessed it at my own institution. On the other hand, teachers need to strike a balance of how best to ask learners to spend their time on asynchronous days and ensure that asynchronous days are not unintentionally overly taxing for students. Administration must be willing to bring, in this case, call faculty into the discussion of how we should move forward in a way that works for everyone. Admin will have to realize that yes, technology might help them get more students, allow them to increase course cap sizes, save space, etc. But at the end of the day, they need to deliver a good product. Otherwise, students will not get jobs and will ultimately go elsewhere. So I'm optimistic about phase 3 because I see some positive indications from colleagues already from their upper administration. For example, one university is now accepting a professor's assessment of incoming student language abilities for international students rather than relying on test scores based on an interview and writing sample. And this is a huge change. There's some indication that admin has started to recognize how well-planned and executed hybrid courses can actually work. Colleagues in Spain recently told me that their university is now reassessing how professors actually get credit for running virtual exchanges, which as part of the design have a significant asynchronous element as well as massively time-consuming planning and assessment components. And admin will have to listen to students. One prediction that many of our colleagues made was that hybrid will become the norm and that admin will be more open to fully online language offerings because students will demand it, maybe. There's also some indication that the admin will do just this, I suppose. One department chair told me that they know this by the way the admin has been asking questions such as, how many courses do you think you can keep online? Rather than, how is what we're doing working for you and your students? Finally, admin will really need to approach faculty in a more empathetic and collaborative way during this difficult transition to a more technology-enhanced pedagogy. In this country, faculty and organizations such as Calico, IALT, AAAL, and TESOL should continue dialogues with administration at all levels to implement technology in ways that make sense for all concerned. All right, so during the pandemic, some report students getting perhaps 1/2 of the interaction time that they used to. And this suggests a need to explore other options for learner interaction, especially conversation practice. Companies like HelloTalk and Conversify saw an uptick in interest during this pandemic, and one representative told me that at first it seemed like teachers just wanted a quick fix, but it turns out that students really liked it. And so we may have we might very well see a continued interest moving forward. Why wouldn't we make use of such companies? If learners don't get enough speaking practice, then give them more speaking practice, at least the foreign language majors. Likewise, learners say that they miss the speaking practice from face-to-face classes. Such tandem speaking partner companies should do well because teachers simply don't have enough time to set up their own language partner relationships. It's extremely time consuming to set up and maintain them. And these companies can be quite sophisticated at doing this. For example, Conversify can keep track of how many minutes a learner actually interacts with their native speaker partner. So virtual exchange and various other affinity spaces are primed to be explored by teachers. I think it's safe for us to assume that the language education world doesn't know much about these things, generally speaking. And engaging in things like virtual exchanges and online communities for language learning requires a shift in thinking whereby we're willing to share control of certain aspects of our course with our students. And some of you know that the Erasmus program in Europe, a student exchange program, has basically evaporated, and that the organization Uni Collaboration, also in Europe, has been inundated with requests for training from teachers, but especially from international offices. In addition to providing a potentially unlimited amount of language and culture learning, things like virtual exchange dovetails nicely with a push for the development of job competencies and soft skills. And this is especially true, again, in the European Union right now, but also in North America as well. So soft skills are those non-technical skills that relate to how you work, things like how you interact with colleagues, how you solve problems, how you manage your work. It also includes people skills, communication skills, listening skills, time management skills, and empathy, among other things. And a recent Forbes article found that most language companies now say that soft skills are critical for their workforce, and that soft skills training delivers a 250% return on investment based on high productivity and retention. And the research on virtual exchanges has shown that they can indeed foster the development of soft skills. Online communities such as fan fiction are huge. There's no denying that. No matter what you're interested in, there's an online community for you, oftentimes in the target language. Such authentic language interaction can be harnessed for instructional purposes, certainly, but you can also frame such a push in terms of building implicit knowledge. Acknowledging that extramural language learning is a reality in much of the world is an absolute necessity moving forward. And the trick is how to harness this. So shifting gears to study abroad, our numbers are dismal, as you know. Many in the call world have been advocating for the integration of traditional study abroad with virtual exchange for years. So I think that traditional study abroad will surely come back, but I think that we probably will see a more of a bookending of physical study abroad with virtual exchange before and after the physical study abroad. And we could potentially see a fundamental change in the structure of study abroad. For example, one colleague suggests that study abroad could become like internships. Students doing, say, a fashion internship in Italy would be obviously immersed in the target language and the target culture, and they could also be taking their actual major classes or classes for their major online from their home institutions. And this way, they would be getting the language and cultural experience as well as the job training while maintaining their trajectory for graduation. Of course, a potential problem here is that these courses would need to be offered asynchronously, most likely. And I'll take this opportunity to plug a brand new book on study abroad by my friends Senta Gödler at MSU and Teresa Schenker at Yale. The fact that we've taken notice that online education is possible on a large scale might lead to a push for universities to establish more of a presence in the students' home countries to actually prepare them for a smoother transition to the US university. The way we currently do this, generally speaking at least, is by testing. And this is a huge business. Universities could essentially get a large part of this market and ensure that the students are actually prepared for their chosen area of study. And according to Inside Higher Ed, international student enrollments have dropped by 43% due to the pandemic and may be very slow to recover. The training could focus on academic English and perhaps even skills that ITAs need, such as training on the classroom culture of the US, as well as special training on prosodic features of the target language, if they'll be teaching. Again, all of these ideas require thinking outside of the box. Many suggest that so much experience on Zoom is pulling us towards this move to hybrid. After all, the only reason to be live in a virtual language classroom is if you want the students to interact, right? I'm sorry, but Zoom is not really especially good for that. One can create instructor recordings for lectures. Many of us already do that, or overview materials as well as student presentations with all sorts of easy to use freeware. And it's much better to use the time for students to engage with this material in an asynchronous way, which can then provide the basis for live interaction via Zoom if you must. But we really need to consider moving beyond Zoom. There are other platforms out there that may be more in line with language teaching, things that offer a real sense of spatiality, for example. And call work from some 15 years ago has shown the importance of spatiality in online interaction. Some tools that have a rather high learning curve, such as Second Life, are probably non-starters for most language teachers. However, there are easy to use tools such as Spatial Chat that offer a good spatially rich option. And I'll thank my colleague, Andrew Ross, for introducing me to this fine tool, which I now use in my classes. So in Spatial Chat, you can set up your classroom with any background you like. And the cool thing about it is that you can have small groups in the same room, just like in a real classroom. And students across the room in, say, group A can see but can't hear students in all the other groups if they're far enough distant from them. And all you need to do is move your image bubble closer to those you want to hear, and their conversation will gradually become more audible. Of course, there are lots of other cool features and some drawbacks as well. But the students seem to respond very well to Spatial Chat from my experience. And many of us have seen that access and connectivity are real issues. So despite the push for more and more tools, what might happen moving forward is that faculty could very well settle on a minimal computing approach because of these concerns about access. Access is related to the welcome and much needed turn towards confronting social justice issues related to language learning. And it's part of that broader discussion of social justice now that we need to engage in. So issues of access are hugely important to that discussion. For example, I've had graduate students from the Navajo Reservation who, when they are home from school, they have to drive quite a distance just to get online access, such as to a McDonald's or some other public place. And the pandemic has shined a spotlight on these access and connectivity issues. I think we need to revisit frameworks such as the TESOL technology standards, which are over 10 years old now, which actually illustrate what teaching and learning with technology might look like in a high, low resource or high, low access environment. Because of access issues, many language technology specialists, again, are recommending that teachers, at least for now, use asynchronous options wherever possible. So we basically need to ask ourselves, what technologies will allow for the most inclusiveness? Back to industry, as companies enter new markets, they're finding that there are many barriers that they hadn't anticipated in terms of access. They didn't anticipate, for example, having a reliable internet connection when designing their products. Who knew? One colleague in industry actually told me how they got around some of these internet connectivity issues by moving the learning product entirely to a mobile platform for smartphones, so an app. And this might help in terms of a household internet connection issue, but one company representative told me that what they had not anticipated is that in many parts of the world, including this country as well, I suppose, smartphones and tablets are still considered very valuable items. And even moving to a mobile platform, parents were reluctant to hand off their smartphone to the children to play with on the learning app for 10, 20, 30 minutes a day. And one pivot, if you will, that this company had to make was then to offer the content in the form of videos that they could stream through TV channels. There'd be some sort of code that the learners could access for learning activities and things like that. Another thing they noticed was that it was much easier to get the parents to click on an SMS link rather than going to the App Store for downloads. The same company has also pivoted in a positive way to integrate anti-racist pedagogy into their products even for very, very young children. I only share this because it's a good example of real innovative thinking that we'll need to embrace moving forward. So despite all of my optimism about moving out of phase 1 and eventually through phase 2 and into phase 3, most of what our colleagues shared with me were their fears and concerns. One of the greatest fears is that there will be a continued disconnect between research and practice in call settings. That we will continue to have a technology-enhanced solution or suite of solutions that is not consistent with the decades of call research, nor that of instructed SLA for that matter. That is, there's been a huge investment in technology such as cameras, multiple monitors in the classrooms, controls on the podium, so you can control what the online students see. And once we have these tools, universities are likely to continue using them, regardless of whether it makes sense pedagogically. There's a real concern that universities will continue to allow the technology to set the framework for what is possible in online L2 education moving forward. Another point that was brought up over and over were the further cuts in faculty and staff. And this is a reality that many schools have already experienced. There's a serious concern that even after we emerge from this crisis, that universities will see that they can get away with using less expensive instructors by using technology. One thing that I've noticed is that universities want to have more and more scalable courses that can accommodate, say, 150 students, when before the same course might have been capped at 35 or so. The way they present this to faculty is, from my experience, is to say that you can have a grader or two. And this might work for some classes, but this assumes a relatively high level of expertise from that grader. Another example of doing more with less, which predates the pandemic, but is surely on the rise, is where professors will record lectures for an entire course that the university can reuse over and over. In this way, they can pay FAs as graders again. So from all of these interviews with colleagues, there was a general consensus that most faculty are pushing for things to go back the way they were. Many said that they felt their colleagues were anxiously waiting for this to happen so that they can get back to doing real things. And this is really worrisome, this mindset that some have that online interactions are not considered a real life thing. There's lots of evidence that young people are not only communicating with peers more online than face-to-face, but that they actually prefer this mode of communication. How then is online interaction not real life? I don't know how widespread this attitude is, but this type of thinking suggests that we will not keep the things that were working well in the online environment. A related concern is that faculty may all hate Zoom so much when the crisis is over that we'll never want to do another virtual meeting or hold a synchronous class again. This Zoomomisia is real, and if you'd like to use that term, go right ahead. So again, we need to get away from looking at the situation moving forward with Zoom as the starting point. Likewise, students may have been turned off to teaching with technology altogether, teaching and learning. This is probably because they've had a terrible experience with it. But I think if we do a good job in stages 2 and 3, it's not likely to happen. So the upshot of this talk was this. As we emerge from the pandemic, rather than try to turn back time, we should embrace what will undoubtedly become a new normal of using technology in language teaching. We have a rare opportunity to build back better, to rethink our relationship to technology for language teaching and learning in a way that's forward-thinking and equitable for all stakeholders. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you. And here are some of the work cited during the talk.
Thank you so much, Bryan, for this inspiring talk. We do have about 5 minutes until the end of the hour. So let us go through the questions. And how should we do this? Why don't we indicate by raising our hands virtually, since there are over 20 of us here, if we have any questions, and as those questions come up, I will be unmuting people. How does that sound? Okay. Okay, Chris has a question. Feel free to unmute yourself, Chris.
Hey, Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I had a question about the ways in which, we're in this kind of amorphous phase where we're kind of shaping what the future of language teaching will look like. It's not set in stone right now. And so, in your view, are there some ways in which um, language teachers, who are often, I guess, more marginal members of the university than, say, a tenured professor might be, in which they can improve their conditions, improve their working conditions, or make suggestions that would lead to improved working conditions, as we're in this sort of amorphous moment?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I don't know if I have a good answer for, I know I don't have a good answer for that, because this is a perennial problem, right? That more adjuncts, for example, if I can use that term, or FAs, or at least folks in multi-year contracts, but not in the tenure stream, can affect change. I am in a right to work state, which as far as I can tell means a right to be fired anytime they want to fire you. But I think it does take what I've seen. Let me put it this way. Let me just use my own experience. What I've seen is, even in places like my institution, there's been like union activity that's developed, and a huge part of that is addressing the concerns of the more marginalized faculty. And so I think it does require working from within. I don't think universities are really good at listening to faculty in general. They're much more likely to listen to students, from my experience. But I think in terms of working conditions, I think it must have just gotten more difficult for part-timers, adjuncts, piecing together a living wage from maybe 2 or 3 or 4 different schools, just because of the nature of the exhaustion of teaching and interacting so much online. I do think that people like us in the IALT world and the Calico world, who are maybe in more advantageous positions, I think it is our responsibility to work with the more marginalized teachers in providing that support for, in terms of maybe workshops, encouraging them to join organizations like IALT and Calico, which are really like families. I've been to both of those conferences many times, and to the one thing that I want my in-service and pre-service teachers, as well as those in in the PhD program, to come away with in the call certificate, is to be able to become better discerning consumers of language teaching technology, and being able to identify the affordances of technologies, and work within the system to harness those technologies in a way that's going to be beneficial for language learning in the way that they, teach it, and which also dovetails nicely with their views of language learning, based on their view of SLA theory and instructed SLA theory. So I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for you, but I do recognize it as a huge problem and challenge.
Okay, I think Stefan has a question too. Stefan, go ahead.
I'm back. Hey, Bryan, thanks for your talk. Appreciate it. An observation and a question. Columbia has done several polling of its students, and this has been replicated at the other Ivies as far as I can tell. I've spoken to my counterparts at the other schools. And language teachers were graded significantly better by students than their peers in other disciplines. in the past 10 months, teaching with technology. Is that the case at ASU as well? So that's kind of the observation and the implied question. And now the question I had for you is, if that is indeed the case, isn't this a window of opportunity for the language community to make its case to the administration that they actually know what they're doing when it comes to teaching with technology, while other people are not so proficient?
Yeah, if that's the case, I think it is. I think there are lots of windows of opportunity that are now open a crack, and I don't know if the ASU experience is the same. I really don't have access to those data, but I do know from speaking with chairs and language departments that over the past, what they saw in the semester of this time last year, as well as in fall, is things like DWFs, so Ds, withdrawals, and Fs were on the decline. Like it just kind of fell off the edge of the chart there, and that continued on for another semester at least. And so I don't know what the reason for that is, but the making the case to administration that we know what we're doing with language learning and teaching, that they really have to be willing to listen, from my experience, and there has to be a conduit in place where you will open that discussion. That discussion will be real, and there will be a not just a waiting to talk, but an actual listening to our language learning or modern language colleagues. I think the potential is there, but I'm not sure that I'm all that optimistic that most universities, and Columbia could be an exception, will make use of that opportunity. And I say that for a couple of reasons. I'm in an English department, which is dominated by literature. Of course, you can say the same thing for foreign language departments. They're generally speaking dominated by lit faculty who do things in a fundamentally different way than language teachers do, right? And so I think many people will be inclined to say, here are the tools that we know are good for teaching that come to us from the IT folks or the educational technology folks, independent of any knowledge or interest or concern for the decades of research into how languages are learned or acquired in the classroom. So I wouldn't know really how to get administration to listen to that, to listen to experts like yourself. But if they do, I think there's a chance now moving forward to make things much, much better in terms of outcomes for learners, and actually increase numbers for foreign language majors where we've seen huge declines in many cases. So yeah, I agree with you that there's a window of opportunity there. I really don't know if the language teachers at my institution were graded better than peers in other disciplines. But I'd imagine that many of us in language teaching are just more aware. It makes sense for us to be more aware of communicative tools and things, things to help enhance listening, things for communicative interaction than our colleagues in, say, the hard sciences, right? So yeah, that's really all I can say about that.
Just a clarification, Brian, the surveys I've seen did not really rank or compare professors. They simply said or students said that language classes, which were much more interactive, much more participatory, presented much more dynamic scenarios, and which were much more inclusive than the other classes that they were exposed to. All these are qualities that can be transposed into other disciplines. If they don't know how to do it, we can show them how to do it.
Mhm.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, and these things, you could have taken the same survey 2 years ago, right? You might have had the same data, right? That they're more interactive and more inclusive for the students. I think so, and I don't know. I'm not an expert in any of these disciplines, but I wonder what kind of pushback we would get throwing this out there from colleagues in business and hard sciences, that maybe they think they're doing this already, or maybe they just have a fundamental. I think what they have is maybe a fundamentally different way of interacting with the material, right? I don't know.
But anyway, but thanks, Brian, anyway.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everybody. It is 4:07, so we're just a little bit over time, 4:08 right now. I think if there are, well, let us maybe conclude the presentation, conclude the talk formally right now. If there are any further questions, we will stick around to discuss them. I will go ahead and stop recording right now.